This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Simulating sand is impossible in Blender, but in Blender 3.1 things have changed. And now you're always asking, like, how do I make my intros? How do I make them look so good, so perfect, so fantastic? Because they are, right? So this intro here is basically the fruit of photo scanning. So I went to my closet, my food closet, because I have one, collected some food items there, and then I went outside and I started photo scanning those. You know, it took some time. I took like 100 to 200 pictures of each food item, and then I made some photo scans out of them. Now, when you start putting those things into the scene, it's always important to pick one thing that is like the main thing. So the bowl, then the 3 bowls, here the sugar, a little mountain of sand here. So it's always like one specific key element, and then you have something around this. For example, here you have these other packages and something in the foreground out of focus. This is always very good to add because this gives like the sense of depth. Start with one main light and try to get the maximum out of this one light. You'll be surprised that actually you need very few lights. Only one strong light that is giving like contrast to the edges of stuff, and this is gonna look nice. Not nice, but nice. And try to use realistic camera moves. I mean, yeah, this one here isn't a realistic camera move, of course, but this is like a cool effect. I like this, so I kept it. But always like try to think, can you actually hold the camera like that? Can you move it like that? Don't use Bezier keyframes to move your camera. This looks just horrible. And it's gonna like slow down. This is not how it should work. Use linear keyframes. Press T and select linear, and this is gonna look like this shot was like taken out from a certain clip. You know, it's gonna look much more professional in my opinion. And as the last thing, try to have something to showcase. In my case, it was the sand. So how did I make that sand actually? Well, we have to abuse Blender quite a lot. We're gonna take Mandaflow and we're gonna simulate some liquids, right? And we're going to crank up the diffusion so much that it starts to behave a little bit more like sand. Then we're going to crank up the particles that we have like a whole lot of those. And then we're going to use a new feature in Blender 3.1, which is native primitive, which means Blender is going to take a point and render it as a sphere, which has infinite resolution, and it's not taxing at all on your hardware. So let's start making the sand clock or the hourglass. So let's delete this cube here. Yeah, this is one of the few tutorials when I delete the cube. And let's add a cylinder, and let's make this like as high. And you know, modeling an hourglass isn't anything super advanced, so I'm still gonna show you because sometimes there are people who don't know. We were all beginners once. We still are. For example, I completely hate animation. Just literally, this is one of the worst things, especially character animation. I try to avoid it so much. You just have to basically scale things to make this look like an hourglass. There is nothing too complicated here. I'm actually gonna just do so that I'm gonna delete thing down here, like being smart, you know, and I'm gonna duplicate this, press the period key, switch to 3D cursor, and rotate this like that, and move this also maybe down a little bit, and now we can basically bridge the edge loops here. You know, I still can model something, right? So Control E, and where is it? Bridge edge loops, right? And now we just need to add something here and scale this thing down. We have an hourglass. How do we simulate something, some sandy things inside here? Well, for that we need a domain, a simulation domain, of course, because this is how simulations work in Blender. Domains usually are cubes shaped because this is how most of the world works right now, with cube-sized domains. There are some stories about, you know, torus-shaped domains on 2-minute papers, but I think these are gonna arrive in like 10 years into Blender especially. So we have to do some cube work until then. It should have like some borders around itself, not to touch it completely because this is getting some unstable results this way. And also we need to add a sand object that is, you know, basically our sand. So let's add a UV sphere. Let's scale this down and let's move this here because this is the area where we want to have some sand. Now, how do we take this sand and make this simulated? Of course, we need to switch to liquid simulation and switch to fluid. We need this to be a flow, because a flow is basically in Blender an object that where things are flowing out of. We switch it to liquid. and flow behavior will be geometry, because geometry means it's only gonna contain this amount of, in this case, sand, and it's not gonna like flow indefinitely into this hourglass. So let's also add one sampling stop step, and this is how it works. This box around here, which is our domain, will be a domain, of course, and it's gonna be a liquid domain with this resolution. And now if you press play, what should happen? Well, you see Blender is giving us already a full Blender experience of simulation, which means it's not working. It's doing some weird things like that. So how do we make this work? Well, I hope it's gonna start working if you switch the file, like the folder destination. So make sure it's somewhere where you have access to it. So I'm gonna save this, for example, to my, I don't know, to my documents, right? So I'm gonna save this to documents, calling a new folder called cache, and I'm gonna keep this there. It's very important because for the intro I had to restart twice because I just was using the temporary folder and it got deleted. So use this cache here, right? Probably cannot see what I'm doing right now. So I'm gonna open a new window on the side here and make this a properties window. Right, so could do this physics settings here. Select the cache or the format volume to be unicache. This probably makes this work. As you see, the liquid is falling, but we cannot see anything because it's of course not visible. So let's make sure that this object here is actually viewport display as wire. Now we can see it's falling, but it's not acting as it's aware of the hourglass. So for that we need to make sure it actually is included in the simulation. Select it to be a fluid and an effector and a collision, of course, and add one substep. And it's still not doing anything. Well, that's because you have to update the domain basically. So let's like just change any parameter. Like for example, let's make the simulation method instead of flip to epic, which is important. It's looking more like sand then. Now you see there are some things happening, which is literally nothing. I mean, we can also increase the resolution to see if this makes anything better, but it doesn't. Well, the reason is that this object here should be a collision that is planar. So it's treating it as a planar object, like a surface, not that it's inside there or anything. We check is planar, and then we also, just for good measures, can remove the face up here. So it's really like a plane that is actually like in a very weird shape, but it's like a plane, you know. So now let's go to this domain again, and let's decrease the resolution, and let's play this. And you see it is working, right? There are two problems we need to fix. The first problem is that it's obviously, you know, it's not realistic to have like those square things here. So for that, what we can do is to increase the randomness. So under this epic simulation method, we also have the randomness here. If we increase the randomness, you see completely random. So I'm going to put this like 10, doesn't matter too much. And now we have this looking a lot better, but it's too much like liquid. This should be sand, you know. Let's make it first come true here. So what would you do? Would you add a force field that's pulling the liquid from here? No, the reason actually is that the simulation cell here is a bit too big for these particles to pass through here. So what we need to do is to increase the resolution to, for example, let's do 60, not 1, but let's do 60, no, 64. Let's also use a larger resolution, like 70. It's almost coming true. But you don't want to use a too large resolution here, because this is going to be an obvious liquid, even if we change the settings. So I think 70 is kind of the max here. If it's not coming true, then the hole is too small, you know. So we take this hole and we make this something like that. Update the domain with the resolution of 68. As you see, this is coming true. This is looking pretty nice, but not definitely like sand. So the first thing to make this better is to actually increase the diffusion of this liquid. So under the settings of this domain, we have the diffusion. So let's turn this on. And this these numbers are basically in this correlation. So this means that, and this means that. I think around 2, 1 and 2 should be the right number. So let's see if this works. This should behave less like liquid now. And I mean, without some splashes and stuff, this should be like more viscous. I don't know how to pronounce this word, but you can understand what I mean. It's definitely better than before. Maybe we can even go down to like 1 here. So now we have to make a little cone here, probably to the right location though. and also render those as these famous native primitive spheres. But first, let's bake like 100 frames of this thing, and while this is happening, let's talk about Squarespace, a generous sponsor supporting this video, by the way. If you've ever felt you need a website or a store, then Squarespace might be the right choice for you. You can use Squarespace to build websites and stores without the need to code, by mainly using templates and customizing them. Now they have a lot of templates. You can filter them based on your needs. For example, if you're a freelancer, you can select online store, professional services, or if you're selling your art pieces, you can select art and design. Basically, whichever site you want to build, there probably is a template there to help you get started. Once your template is chosen, you can start building your website, and it's rather easy. You don't have to code, you can just drag and drop and type. They also make it very convenient to add payment and checkout processing. If you're selling your services or your art, it's working pretty much out of the box. So if you feel it's time for a site, then go to squarespace.com and start your free trial. It's free for the first 14 days. And when your site is ready, then go to squarespace.com/badnormals to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And that's it. I think this is looking pretty fine. But the problem now is that we have way too little particles. Like, is this an hourglass? Of course not. And to add more of those particles, what we can do, there are three things. The first thing is to actually make those particles smaller so that we can actually see those, right? Like when there are many. And now the first thing you see is that here we have two triangles, right? One here and one like inside here. One here in the center has less particles. And that's because we have a system called narrow bandwidth, which means basically, where is it? It's here, narrow bandwidth. And this is basically saving resources while simulating only the surface of the liquid with more resolution and detail, while the internals are kept more like low-res stuff, you know. So this is good and stuff if you want to simulate liquids, for example, because it doesn't matter what's happening inside, the surface isn't reacting to it too much. But for sand, I want this hourglass to be filled. Okay, so I'm gonna increase this to like 10, and let's see if the thing is now smaller than it was before. Well, you see, we don't have too much of a triangle inside here anymore. So this has worked. The second thing that we can add is this sampling and then the particle maximum and minimum. I can make this like minimum, maximum 1000. This is going to give you some bad results. You have those blocky things here, as you have seen, right? Like here, because we have way too many particles put into a very small space. So don't use like 1000 here, but maybe like 128 and the minimum of 64 or something. So it still has some room to like optimize. Yeah, we still have those, but maybe they're not as crazy as they were before. I think this is looking pretty much like sand, or like when it's falling, of course not like that. We don't have a cone yet, but I'm gonna come to this in a minute. And the thing is, we have like this weird like thick thing here. We don't want this. So let's duplicate this thing and let's use a different thing for the simulation. So let's just delete these faces from here like that, and now let's simulate again. Let's see if this makes anything better. But I think this is working better than before, in my opinion. And I think I'm gonna go forward with this thing. Yeah, we still have like a thick thing here, but it's at least now in the middle. Well, we need a cone here, of course, because sand is falling inside of a cone. If you need a cone, you know, Blender is helpful. Mesh, Shift A, add a mesh and a cone. And we scale this to something that you would feel would fit inside of this hourglass. You know, look with your artistic eye. I think this looks rather nice. Maybe a little bit more like that. And then let's select this cone and then let's add a Boolean modifier and select this simulation hourglass, and let's select intersect. So now you have basically this cone inside of this hourglass, right? Perfectly. And we are going to move this like that. I think this is looking okay. And let's also add a remesh modifier, because the topology is just horrible in case of a cone. And I think it's wiser to like remesh before adding a Boolean, because then the edges are going to be sharp. Maybe something like that, you know. Now this is okay. Okay, let's add this remeshing and let's keep the Boolean by now. And as you see, it is falling into this place. So let's just move the cone into the place where the liquid is falling. And is this the place? No, it's not quite. Yeah, This is fine. So now the cone is here, but we need to make this react with the liquid. So to do this, select this little physics tab right here and go to fluid and select effector and of course collision and add one substep. Okay, the simulation has baked and you see this is working in a sense, but the problem is that it's not too much like liquid still, I think. So like sand. So let's increase the exponent to 2 and let's make one more bake. And as you see now this is looking pretty nice because we increased the exponent to 2 and I also moved the cone pretty much to the center, like it's a bit off, but it's not a problem. And yeah, you see it is looking nice right like from the side, but the problem is the liquid is, you know, doing some kind of a gathering here, you know, it's starting to have a little meeting here. So this is not nice, right? We have to make sure that the liquid is never reaching those borders. It's removed before it reaches those, because this is a clear giveaway that this is a liquid, not a sand. So to solve this, let's press Shift S, cursor to world origin, and let's add a circle. Let's build a wall, you know, the great wall, and move this around here where we don't want the liquid to be anymore. And let's go to edit mode, press 1 and extrude on the Z axis, something like that. This should be for about the right size for the outflow basically. Maybe just tweak the size of the outflow a little bit more so that it is more closer here, and always make sure that this is a planar outflow, otherwise it's not gonna work. So something like that on the sides. And now let's bake this and see how this looks. What an English. And yes, now this is looking perfect, I think. The liquid is disappearing. We have this little mountain of sand here, which we're gonna add sand particles later on onto this mountain. And the only problem is that, you know, when this starts, you see we have this thing falling down, and basically the first, like, I think maybe 40 frames are just a waste, basically, because we don't need this, right? It is also acting like a liquid up here, and we don't want this, right? So let's make sure that this starts actually like 60 frames before and then continues, right? And this is how you can basically shift the time of your simulation. You also have to switch this to, instead of being a replay, switch this to all, and just press bake, and now this is gonna bake before this, and also your main frame range is gonna be beautiful and better than it was before. And now the simulation is finished, the sand is ready, it's time to render. So when you render right now, what you're gonna see is first, of course, Eevee, and we don't want Eevee. Eevee is not gonna work in this case. So we switch to cycles, and you see this box here, this is the domain. We don't want this, so make sure the domain is hidden. And now we have this like broken hourglass here. We don't want this either. This is like the simulation one, but we have a nice one on this side. So let's just make sure that we move this one here, and we basically just match them, right? We are just gonna like move them like that. And now let's see how this looks. Of course, you cannot see through right now. So I'm gonna hide this one as well. This is gonna be our render hourglass. We don't need this object as well, the flow object. And we don't need the outflow objects. And somehow the particles have disappeared. I mean, how can we make them, if we hide the domain, how can we make them visible? Well, for that you need a modifier which is called the particle instance modifier, and it does so that, for example, you have a monkey head and you're gonna add this modifier there, and it's gonna duplicate the monkey everywhere, and it's gonna duplicate the monkey everywhere where there are particles, right? So we're gonna just add a cube and press M and merge at center. So now we have just a small vertex, a single vertex in the center of the world. It has to be in the center of the world. And now we're gonna add a modifier which is a particle instance modifier. And this is basically, you know, a modifier where you can select the object of the particle system, so the domain in this case. And now you see we have duplicated this vertex on the location of every single particle in our case. And the question is, how do we make them visible? Because when we render right now, I mean, they are black and invisible basically. What we need is geometry nodes. So we're going to take a geometry node editor from here, add a geometry node tree on this one here, and add a node called mesh to points. So mesh to points, right like that. And now you see things, right? And these are the same points you see every day in geometry nodes, if you use geometry nodes every day. But you know, they are just rendered as spheres with infinite resolution, which is very, very cool because, I mean, you can zoom in just as much as you want. They have infinite resolution in Blender 3.1. You need 3.1 for this, right? How do we make them a bit more like sand? Well, first let's add an HDR, which is looking hopefully a bit better. And then let's add a random value to change the radius of those things. So mesh the points, and let's add a random value to the radius. And let's make sure like the smallest one is 1 and the largest one is 2. And then add a math node afterwards and divide this whole thing with a large number, for example, 500. And indeed, this looks like sand, you know. Maybe up here, let's see if they are a bit too small or too big. I think they have the nice size to them, so we don't have to be like worried at all. Now, we need some colors for them, but we also need sand particles down here. So how do we add those down here? We just take this mountain and we add geometry nodes, right? And then we add a distribute points on faces like that. And now we have some weird things because we have scaled the object. So select the object, right? The cylinder in our case, and press Ctrl A, apply scale. And now if you render again, these are all looking like spheres, which is incredible. We just need to, you know, have like quite a lot more of those. So I'll select Poisson disk so you can control the distance between spheres, and add like, you know, 100,000 for this thing. And now we have a lot of spheres here, but we need them to be smaller. So let's take a random value. Again, let's take 1 here and let's put 2 here. And let's add a math node to make this actually smaller. The reason why I'm like putting big numbers here and dividing them is that I just have more control. I can, you know, slide easier with my mouse. And here is a division, and let's divide by 500, and let's, you know, we don't have anything to input this to. Well, we have a node called radius, set point radius. So we put this here and we put this there. And now you see we have smaller points. But we should have some, I think, let's like compare those to the ones from the simulation. Are they similar? They are pretty similar, so that is fine, I think. But we should just have a distance between them, like 2 millimeters, maybe, something like that. Yes, I think now this is working pretty well. This is looking like sand, but we haven't got the material yet. So let's add a set material in the end. And I also forgot to tell you that we actually need the original, you know, cone also, because this is like just, we have to have something below those sand particles so that it is looking a bit more realistic. So we just need a join geometry, and we need to join those together after adding the material, right? Now we have something below those spheres. And we also need to actually add a material, you know. So I'm going to go to Material tab and add a new material called Sand. And also another one which is called the sand cone or sand bed or whatever. So basically the cone that is below those spheres, it's going to also have a material. And duplicate this material setting node basically. So the cone is going to have the sand cone material, and the sand is going to have the sand material. And this is how the nodes look. I think not too complicated at all. And let's create this material, you know. Let's also add the sand material to the simulation. So I selected the simulation node tree and also add a set material and a sand material, right? And now let's switch this whole thing to shader editor. And let's select the sand material from the side here. And, well, the first thing is the color, of course. So I'm going to go up here, well, where we have like a lot of those sand particles. And I'm going to add a point info node, which is a new node in Blender. This wasn't available before. So now we have a random value for each of those points. We can plug this as the base color. This immediately looks better, but we need a color ramp to make this whole thing yellow, you know. So which yellow color is looking the best? I think something like that. And then let's make sure the other color is also the same. And let's make the first one like a little bit darker, you know, so that we have some variance. And I think this might be a little bit too golden, so I'm gonna switch the hue to the more yellow side, 0.108, and this one also 0.108. And this is looking better, but not perfect, because you know, some sand particles are pretty dark. So let's take a math node to accomplish that. Let's take a random value here. Let's use a greater than. So we compare it to a value. And if the random value is larger than this threshold, it's gonna get a white value. So obviously, if you have like a pretty large threshold here, it's gonna only have like a few of those selected. And we're gonna make those black or dark. So we're gonna use mix RGB and this thing as the factor, and nothing happens. Well, we need to multiply the color with something dark. So now we have something like that. I think this looks instantly so much better than this. And now we have this. I mean, these few dark ones really sell the effect of sand, in my opinion. Down here also. Maybe we have too many. It depends. Like I can increase the threshold. Okay. Right. So, but sand is also transmissive because it's made of silicon, and silicon is what you can make glass of, if I'm not wrong. So, you know, this thing looks a lot more like sand, right? Maybe the transmission shouldn't be as high, but something like 0.7, and roughness should be, I don't know, like 0.6, something like that. So this is like the sand, you know, maybe transmission even, I don't know, something, right? And now the only material left is the cone below this sand. So sand cone, I'm basically going to use the same sand color. Oh, sorry. I'm going to use the same sand color things here. I'm going to copy those and I'm going to paste them here. Wow. I don't know why I even do this with my mouse, but I'm going to paste them here and I'm going to use this as the base color. Of course, this is not going to change anything because the point info node is useless, right? Shift, right click, drag, by the way, to make things like that. And I'm going to delete this and I'm going to use a Voronoi texture instead. So Voronoi texture, Control T, use the object coordinates, and let's scale this thing up until we have like those dots down here. And let's take a bump node and use this as the bump of our mesh, connect this to the normal. And let's see how this looks. I'm going to take off the base color. Now this looks like that, not too great. So let's invert this. And now these look like sand grains basically from far away. But we also need to change the color. So for that, we have this color thing here that we can use as the input, right? So now these are transformed into the same color things as the sand grains, and we are going to use this as the color. Right, now we have some sand. It is looking, I think, pretty nice, except the base sand should also be transmissive. So let's do maybe something like that and some more roughness. Less specularity because sand is not as specular, I suppose. And the sand is ready. It's looking nice. Now the next thing that we need is, of course, the render hourglass. So we take the render hourglass, right? We put it here for the final render. And then what we do is that we add a solidify modifier to make this, you know, to add some thickness to it. Now we have a hole up here. So to fill this up, what we just need is to select this with Shift Alt, Control F, grid fill, right? And then, well, just dial in the thickness that you like. I think something like that looks okay. And let's see how this render is looking. Well, it's looking like that, which is pretty nice. The one thing that should be better is that, you know, let's apply the solidify modifier and let's go into this centerpiece of this hourglass and let's scale this thing up a little bit using proportional editing with S. So I'm gonna scale this like that. If the internal part is moving along, you have to check connected only here so that it's working for you. And let's add a subdivision, you know, to make this look better. This is done. Currently, it's all from me. If you want to have this file and also some selected nice files from the intro, including those photoscan assets for you to use for free, Patreon is your way to go. You know, you can have a lot of stuff there. For example, live streams. Every month we're gonna have a live stream. You can ask questions. So check out Patreon and see you next time. By the way, this HDR looks like so cool on this Hourglass. I think I'm gonna use this in the thumbnail.